The United States is sending 12 warships to the Middle East. The U.S. Secretary of Defense it claims without any hesitation that we'll be sending U.S. Air power to fight on the behalf of Israel should there be a war down there without any question at all. What in the world is going on? Is the United States about to get sucked into yet another Middle Eastern war? Well, to unpack all this, we have the inestimable Douglas Macgregor, chairman and CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat vet, and just all around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be here.
You know, I would love to, if we could have you come on and talk about some of the, finer nuances of things and lay out some visions about what the U.S. should do or so, which we probably should do that anyway. But man, it seems like there's so many things going on that we need your expertise on what's happening right now. And to kind of alert people to some of the hidden dangers of what our U.S. policymakers are doing. And man, is this ever an example of that? Obviously, the situation in the Middle East has been roiling for a long time, especially since the explosion in October of last year, and things just got a lot worse in the last few days. And before we get into a lot of that, I want to bring in the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who was asked whether we would be participating if anything goes hot in the war against Lebanon.
If Israel is attacked, we certainly will help defend Israel. You saw us do that in April. You can expect to see us do that again. But we don't want to see any of that happen. We're going to work hard to make sure that we're doing things to help take the temperature down and address issues through diplomatic means.
Okay, so I wonder if you can interpret, we're seeking a diplomatic means when he's leading with, oh yeah, if Israel is attacked, we're going to be with them. And of course, the last time that did happen, when we did fight, when he mentioned the last time, it was because Israel attacked and destroyed an embassy facility in Syria, which violated every international norm that you can imagine for centuries. And then they were attacked and we went in to help them. What do you hear when you hear him talk about we will defend Israel if they get attacked by Hezbollah?
I think that has to be interpreted as reinforcement of the guarantee that was given in private to Mr. Netanyahu that if he decides to widen the war in the region, which I think he's done, and take on both Hezbollah and Iran, as well as the militias in the region, that we are going to support him. That, after all, is the real reason behind his visit to the United States. I mean, he enjoys the accolades that are showered on him when he comes to visit, and he loves to be seen by his own population effectively in charge of Washington, which he is. I mean, he controls more of what happens here right now, particularly in foreign and defense policy, than Joe Biden likely. So he's gotten what he wanted from key figures inside the administration, in the cabinet, but most important also from the Senate and the House. Remember, there was only one Republican who absented himself from the speech, as I recollect. I think that's Thomas Massie. There were eight or nine Democrats who didn't show up, but virtually everyone else was there. So that was a sign of American fealty to Israel. And he's got the guarantees that he wanted. And now you see additional forces being sent to the region. Once again, a clear and unambiguous signal that we're ready to fight alongside the Israelis.
Now, this could go sideways pretty quick. I mean, I want to look at two separate aspects of this because, first of all, there's the potential incursion into Lebanon against Hezbollah by Israel. But then there's also the potential that this could escalate to include Iran. I want to look at those separately. So first of all, just talk about from the military perspective, is for the IDF, after having fought almost 10 months of war now in the Gaza Strip, do they have the capacity and the ammunition supplies, by the way, to launch an incursion into southern Lebanon, which, by all accounts, the Hezbollah has been basically preparing for since 2007, 2008, for this kind of conflict?
Well, I think the Israelis certainly have the ammunition they need. We've provided, almost without question, anything they asked for. So I don't think there's a shortage on the ammunition side. Now, the ground force, as you know, is much like a large Army National Guard. You have very competent, exceptionally professional people at the top who know what they're doing. But once you get down below the lieutenant colonel and below level, you're running into large numbers of people who are effectively reservists or guardsmen. They are not extraordinarily well trained, although I'm sure they've gotten a lot of good training and experience in over the last 10 months. They've taken a number of casualties. I've seen all sorts of figures, something like 70,000 casualties, 4,000 or 5,000 dead. I have no idea because, as we know, the first casualty in war is always the truth. Neither the Israelis nor anybody else involved in this is willing to tell anybody the truth. So we don't know. But I think we can say with some certainty that the ground force has been stretched. But keep something in mind. The Israelis see this as primarily an air and missile campaign. With the ground force, it will go in to mop up. And I'm talking specifically about Hezbollah. We are also viewing this as an air and missile campaign. And that, if for no other reason, because we don't have much to send in terms of ground forces. So
I want to look at that. You're talking about the missile forces. One of the things that seemed evident from I think it was June strike when Iran sent 350 missiles and drones, and the Iron Dome allegedly, anyway, knocked out 95% or something like that. But it was in analysis afterwards. We had Professor Ted Postel on, who said when you look at it, actually many of the missiles were not intercepted, and many of those that were designed to be shot down to try to avoid escalation. But he said that if Iran had actually wanted to harm Israel, they could have picked a lot different targets and caused a lot more damage. And Hezbollah, number one, their time of flight now is far less than they would have. They have more of these missiles. There's some suggestion that the Iron Dome may not be very effective at all, and it could Israel could be seriously harmed by the Hezbollah missiles.
Well, the Iron Dome has never performed to the level as advertised. 90+% intercepts. That's always been nonsense. So no, they're getting something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of what's out there. But keep in mind that everyone's missile arsenal or stocks are designed to exhaust the air defense capability. So you can run the Israelis, and for that matter, us, out of anti-missile missiles very quickly. Doesn't take very long. And we are not disposing over hot manufacturing lines or building missiles and rockets hand over fist on a daily basis. So we have limited supplies. The Iranians and the Shiites in Hezbollah are in a different position. What we don't know is how this will begin. I think it's pretty obvious that you're going to get a major war in the region. That's unfortunate. A lot of us have tried very hard to persuade everyone not to go down this road, but I think Mr. Netanyahu will. As a result, I think there will be an attack on Hezbollah by Israel. Now, bear in mind, you've got Lloyd Austin saying we're going to help them if they're attacked. Well, they're already under attack. And the Israeli attitude is that we're the permanent victims in the region, so whatever we do is defense anyway.
Yeah.
So that's a foregone conclusion. What kind of assistance are we going to provide other than logistical and munitions? We are going to provide as much air and naval power as we can mobilize. And that will be directed wherever the Israelis, frankly, urge us to go. Now, we're obviously prepared to attack Iran. If we see evidence that the Iranians are going to join in this fight, we've got target overlays. We're definitely ready to go. The question is what happens with Hezbollah? And, I've said from the beginning that I think the Israelis know that the Hezbollah fight is an existential one. And the only way to win that is to pulverize Hezbollah with everything they've got. And that may include tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay. Now, I want to look at it from a slightly different perspective. So our country, our choice. I know you're also very interested in the U.S. Constitution, following the rule of law within our own country, et cetera. When I hear Austin categorically saying, not even the president, but the Secretary of Defense saying, yes, we're going to help Israel fight if they get into a war. Mm-hmm. Where did the Congress ever authorize the United States to get into war? Because what you just described right before I brought this question up is something that could potentially expand into target sets in Iran. And that, by definition, is a war. And how can we get into something like this if it's not authorized by Congress in the U.S. Constitution?
Well, as we know, Washington is donor-occupied territory. Everybody who clapped vigorously for Mr. Netanyahu has been the beneficiary of the Israel lobby's largesse. I mean, if you go back and look at their campaigns and look at who pours money into their political action committees and helps them stay in office, the lobby has a big role in that. So do the pharmaceuticals, so do the defense industries. So Congress really isn't responding to the American people. The Constitution is a wonderful document, but I don't think anybody's paid much attention to it for a very long time. So we are living in, I'm afraid, a post-constitutional environment. This is one of the reasons that, we talk about where do we put our emphasis, because we can't fight every battle. And at Our Country, Our Choice, we talk all the time about the criticality of the Bill of Rights. And we have to fight to the bitter end to preserve those. Those are also under attack because those are frequently inconvenient. We've already seen legislation passed creating special categories of Americans that deserve more protection than others. And we've also seen attempts to shut down free speech that doesn't suit the majority that happens to be in power at the moment. So these are big problems. They're all bound up together. But the truth of the matter is, Americans, when I say Americans, I always caveat that by saying, well, who are the Americans? I mean, you and I are Americans. We're people that just say, if you ask us on the street, what are you? I say, I'm an American. I don't say I'm something else an American. I don't say I'm an American and then something else. I just say, hey, I'm an American. That's it, just an American. Now, those people who are just Americans have really not engaged. They've got to get engaged. So if you don't signal to people on the Hill that in theory represents you, that you are utterly opposed to this madness, well, then the madness is going to happen. And you have yourself to thank for it. And right now we've got a lot of people that are either not paying attention or have foolishly signed on for the nonsense.
Well, and let me just show you one more piece of the nonsense. So I just showed you the Secretary of Defense talking categorically how he's ready to send U.S. forces to assist another country that doesn't belong to our forces. But then here's John Kirby, who I think you might charitably say is stretching the truth or obscuring the truth, because what he is claiming here is that we're just looking for peace. We're all about negotiated settlement. Watch this.
All of this adds to the complicated nature of what we're trying to get done. And what we're trying to get done is a ceasefire deal that can get you 6 weeks in phase one, get a lot of hostages, the most at-risk, out of there and home with their families, and get some more humanitarian assistance in. Based on the constructive conversations that we had with the Prime Minister last week, we still believe that this is a worthy endeavor. We still believe that the gaps can be narrowed, the details can be fleshed out, and a deal can be had. Now, again, it's too soon to know what these recent events over the last 24, 48 hours are going to do to the process. I don't want to sound overly sanguine here, but we still believe the deal on the table is worth pursuing, and the hostages need to come home, and we're not going to stop trying to work on that.
It's hard for me to even just keep my composure when I hear this official statement by the senior White House spokesman say that our constructive conversations with Netanyahu last week are still hopeful that we can get a deal, ceasefire, get the hostages back at Hall, when the events that he was referring to there is the assassination of the negotiating partner on the Hamas side, all but killing any kind of possibility of constructive talks. So how to view those things when they say that such things that seem so at odds with truth?
The short explanation is that this government and the society they currently dominate right now has been Sovietized. It all reminds me of 1968. And I was alive in 1968 and quite aware of what was happening. In fact, I was in what used to be called Czechoslovakia about a week and a half before the Soviets intervened there. But there was a crisis in Czechoslovakia as far as Moscow was concerned, because the Czechoslovak Republic had suddenly blossomed into something everyone called the Prague Spring, which was designed to quietly democratize the government, to enhance the rights and privileges of the citizenry, to suppress the use of the secret police and the political apparatus. Well, from Moscow's standpoint, this was a terrible threat. And I remember listening to the translations of the announcement. Today, the commander of the Warsaw Pact announced that the unrest and civil disobedience and the potential for outright revolution in the Czechoslovak People's Republic has gone too far. Now the forces of liberation, the Soviet armed forces and their brotherly armed forces from surrounding Warsaw Pact members, will go in and rescue the Czechoslovak population from the danger of a counter-revolution that could destroy socialism and derail the progress that's been made for several years. I mean, it's the same sort of nonsense. We know the rest of the story. They went in, they crushed what was happening. And the Czechs in particular were very funny because they stood around and said, well, let's change all the street signs so the Soviets can't find their way around Prague and other kinds of things. But there wasn't a whole hell of a lot they could do. Well, we have a similar situation now in Washington. We're in the business of saying, oh, no, the sky is not blue. It's actually deep purple. And there are no clouds in the sky. Ignore those large black fluffy things up there. That's not at all a danger. But on the other hand, we're very concerned about the white clouds, and those white clouds have to be carefully monitored. The world is being stood on its head. So it's one lie on top of another lie. No one is interested right now in Israel in peace. And as long as Mr. Netanyahu and his electorate are not interested in peace, neither is the United States Congress. Now, whatever the American people think is irrelevant.
That's not very encouraging, but that's kind of how I see it. And there's one other person that kind of sees it that way. And we at least have one good one to put in here. This is former Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who was responding to what Kirby and some of these other people have been saying about what the U.S. government is claiming to do. Here's what they actually are doing.
I believe it represents an effort by Prime Minister Netanyahu, which he began 9 months ago, to entangle the United States in Israel's wars with the Palestinians and its neighbors. And I think if you are serious about negotiating a hostage release and a ceasefire, you don't murder your opposite number at the negotiating table. So any doubt that anyone may have had about whether Israel was sincere in pursuing an agreement with Palestinians has now been eliminated.
Well, hard to add much onto that, but I mean, he's one of the few that's calling it like it is. But
well,
then
I might just say very briefly, use the word sincerely. I think Mr. Netanyahu is sincerely interested in the elimination of all the Arabs that currently live in the area he calls Greater Israel. A journalist returned not long ago from the Middle East and reported that he actually saw Israeli soldiers wearing a patch that depicts Greater Israel. In other words, Israel consists of everything between the river and the sea, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, and the Palestinian enclaves have vanished. They don't exist. Now, I don't know whether or not that also included everything south of the Litani River, but I think Mr. Netanyahu, is sincerely interested in annihilating everything south of the Litani River. And if Iran, which I think will happen, inevitably intervenes, then he's comfortable now that the United States will act on his behalf to utterly destroy and pulverize Iran into submission.
Well, I mean, Austin just flat out said that. So, I mean, I think that's pretty confirmed from our government. But then on top of all that, then we also, and I'd be remiss if I didn't show our lead diplomat here, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who threw his 2 cents in.
Hania was involved in ceasefire talks in Gaza. What impact is his death going to have?
Well, of course, I've seen the reports, and what I can tell you is this. First, this is something we were not aware of or involved in. It's very hard to speculate, and I've learned over many years never to speculate on the impact one event may have on something else. So I can't tell you what this means. I can tell you that the imperative of getting a ceasefire, the importance that has for everyone remains. And we will continue to labor that for as long as it takes to get there.
Doug, I just it's hard for me to stomach these kinds of statements, which we've been hearing for many months now, and also you can add a whole new category regarding the Russia-Ukraine war from Anthony Blinken. But when he keeps talking about we're actually seeking peace, and you see every action does the opposite, as Gary and I were talking earlier today on a different topic, it's like our trust in anybody in our government at the top levels is just getting shredded by the day.
Well, there are two things that we should keep in mind. First, General Sisi's staff commented after Blinken last visited Egypt that the general and his staff had grown tired of listening to Mr. Blinken repeat Mr. Netanyahu's talking points. So I think that's the first thing we need to keep in mind. Mr. Blinken is doing an excellent job of everything that Mr. Netanyahu wants him to do. Number two, and this is equally important in my judgment, he's interested, as is most of Washington, in buying as much time as possible for the Israelis to complete their task of creating greater Israel. In other words, eliminate all of the Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank. And they now realize that that's not going to happen unless they can also bring to heel Hezbollah and subjugate that area. So we are buying time for them to do that. Now, it has now moved beyond buying time because it can't be done, certainly not in the time frame that they would like. And instead, what you've got is brewing a new war. Normally, you would expect the American government to intervene and say, well, look, we're not prepared for a major war. We didn't commit to that. But the truth is, behind closed doors, that's exactly what we've committed to do. That's what Mr. Austin said, and that's exactly what we're about to do. We are going to involve ourselves in a war with not only Hezbollah, but also Iran. And we can go over this 1,000 times. All of the Arab states in the region are horrified and afraid. The elites don't want any wars, but their populations are angry on a scale that one can't imagine with what's happened to the Arabs in Gaza. But you also have another problem. You have the rest of the world, and you have Russia and China, and increasingly Turkey. Turkey is trying to build nuclear reactors to improve its energy position. It's trying to stabilize its economy, so it has worked hard to stay out of the fight. But the Turks aren't going to be able to stay out of the fight if the Israelis march into South Lebanon and initiate this campaign of annihilation, which I think we have to expect. And I think that's what the Turks are worried about. So you could have the entire region finally engaged in this. Can we actually compensate for whatever power Israel doesn't has and needs? I don't know, but I think it's going to be tough. But obviously, Mr. Erdogan is confident that we can ensure that he prevails.
Now, Erdogan has a reputation for a lot of incendiary language. He used a lot of incendiary language, especially shortly after the Gaza operation began last October and November. And a lot of people said, oh, just don't worry about what he says because he's just talking to his domestic audience. Maybe there's some justification to some of that. This one has a sense, it feels a little different to me because he's being very specific in some of the things that have been attributed to him, that if Israel goes into Lebanon, then he said he would attack into Israel. Do you think there's any set of circumstances where a NATO ally, Turkey, would actually go to war against Israel?
Well, first of all, I think NATO is largely a paper organization. And that's something that Americans don't realize. And if anything, behind the scenes in Europe, NATO is crumbling. Turkey has been on the outs with NATO, as we say, for a very long time. Membership, as far as the Turks are concerned, in NATO and in the European Union, they've never gotten into the EU, but they've been promised the opportunity. None of that has ever paid off. And the Turks have had to make a decision. It's a decision the Europeans need to make, and they're afraid to. But the Turks have said, look, we're Turks. We're Muslim Turks. We're not Europeans. We're not part of Europe, per se. And that's a fact. The Turks have decided, well, we've had it. We've tried everything we can. We're not going to bother with you anymore. And so the notion that the Turks could become involved in this, I think, is completely legitimate and should be expected. So I don't think NATO means anything at all. I've always been concerned, and I expressed this view to President Trump, both written and otherwise, back in December of 2020, that we should get our troops, our forces, and everything we own out of Turkey. Because at some point, our troops on the ground in Turkey could become hostages. And remember, we still have some nuclear weapons in Turkey. We got to get them out, because this is no longer the Cold War. We're in a different world now. Turkey is a sovereign state. It's going to behave in accordance with what it thinks is its interests. It's not aligned with us. If anybody thinks that the things you and I are discussing about Israel are not understood or appreciated in the Middle East or Asia, they're deluded. We are viewed as Israel's tool.
Well,
We
and
are seen as being governed by Israel.
yeah, and
Israel is seen as dominating us, not the other way around.
To underscore that, painfully so, this was part of Netanyahu's speech before a joint session of Congress, where he's trying to claim that, hey, we're all in this together.
I choose my words carefully. We've jointly developed some of the most sophisticated weapons on earth that help protect both our countries. And we also help keep American boots. We help keep Americans' boots off the ground while protecting our shared interests in the Middle East.
So it's our shared interest in the Middle East for the United States to get sucked into a war. And by the way, you mentioned a second ago that it was Austin's words that said that we're going to, well, despite whatever the Secretary of the State said, here's what's actions is happening, that 12 U.S. warships are now reported to be steaming into the area as the tensions rise here. So it seems that we're actually getting ready to do Netanyahu's bidding.
Well, obviously, and once again, as we mentioned earlier, we don't have the ground force to put in there. I'm told that there's some consideration is being given to putting a Marine force of perhaps 2,000 on the ground in Israel. We'll see whether or not that happens. Obviously, 2,000 Marines on the ground in Israel guarantees that somebody's going to get killed if you go to war with Hezbollah and Iran. It's going to be impossible to avoid having something fall on you. But it's not going to make a great deal of difference to the outcome on the ground. Let's be frank, the numbers are just too small. So I don't know, but I think air and missile power, that's where we're headed. And we've got probably as much as we can load onto any of the platforms, the Aegis cruisers, destroyers, plus the aircraft carriers. And we're prepared to fight. And we will go in and we will attack shoulder to shoulder with the Israelis. And we will end up at war with I suspect most of the Middle East, and I think we're probably going to end up dealing with the fallout here at home inside the United States, because we've got these open borders. We don't know who's in the country. I think we do have an inkling of what's in the country. And I think from the standpoint of the people running the administration and the government, they might think this is a great thing. You know, if we can drag the American people in the United States into a permanent state of conflict with everyone in the region, that's good for Israel. I think I have to view it that way.
Okay, let me look, kind of drill down on the military perspective for a second. If we can say, and for the sake of this argument, let's just say that nuclear escalation can be avoided, and we'll see how that works out. But just from a military conventional perspective, it seems to me that in the modern era, of course, air and missile power is absolutely essential and crucial and vital. But it's also not enough. I think you've said several times, you still have to have a land force, because you can't take and hold terrain unless you have somebody on the ground. You can throw missiles all over the place, but you can't gain anything. So my concern is, or my question rather, is on what basis does Israel want to fight with Lebanon, in southern Lebanon? Now they can, because they could physically go and take around there. But if you also drag in Iran into it, you can throw a bunch of missiles, but you're not going to go and take Iran, especially this tiny little Israel, even if they got us fully engaged. So what is the end state that even is achievable for Israel to not have a permanently hostile Iran if they go into war with them?
Well, the Israeli end state is greater Israel, as a minimum, what we described earlier, and they think that's achievable. That may be. I don't know. I have my doubts, but that's their firm conviction. No one is interested in taking and holding anything, least of all Americans. There's nothing to take and hold that's of any real value to us. I think the interest is in destroying Iran, not holding it, not utilizing it or exploiting it, but destroying it.
Right, but
And Iran is
short
a
of nuclear
large
weapons,
country.
we
I mean,
can't
look,
destroy Iran, right? I mean, we can cause lots of damage, but we can't destroy it just with air and missile power, right?
well, you can do it. You can do an awful lot of damage. You have to look at where the population of Iran is actually concentrated. Much of Iran is desert and mountain, where there frankly isn't much. It's an area larger than Western Europe. So look at where the 79 million Iranians live. It's not very difficult to destroy their water supply, destroy their power grid, destroy ultimately over time their armed forces. That can be done. Now, it's not going to be easy. They're going to fight back, and they have some capability now that they did not years ago. And I'm talking about their ability to reach out and touch us, to attack our 26 bases in the region and kill Americans. There's no doubt about it. But you can do so much damage that you create another wave of refugees and migrants that start going where? Well, they'll pour into Turkey. They're going to go north. They're going to try and go into Europe. They're not going to sit there and be destroyed, starve to death, or end up dying for lack of water. I mean, you can inflict those kinds of damages. You don't need to go into the country. And I think the Air Force is probably, and the Navy is salivating at the prospect, because that's what they've always theorized could be done. You can win a war without any ground force. Well, if your only goal is destruction and murder, they have a point, because there's no reason why we would want to intervene on the ground in Iran. There's nothing there for us. Why are we doing it? So we are essentially extending the range and capability of Israeli striking power, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so forth. That's what we're doing. And that can do a lot of damage. Now, we haven't discussed who else may object to the total destruction of the Iranian state and the mass destruction of its people. There are other states out there that are not going to be particularly excited about that. Clearly, the Pakistanis are not going to be excited. I don't think India will be excited by it. I know the Russians are going to be horrified if that happens. And again, we come back to Turkey. Turks aren't going to like it. If you go to Northeast Asia, it's not just the Chinese who want access to the Straits of Hormuz, which would likely be closed. It's also Japan, Korea, a number of other states in the region that depend on access to those fossil fuels. In other words, this has global impact. The impact is not just in the region, it's global, and it's going to be economic, it's going to be political and military. And at some point, we may discover that we're up against far, far more adversaries and opponents than we reckoned would be the case.
Okay.
Again,
And so
you got to distinguish the desired end state, which is greater Israel, from what is possibly going to happen that's very different from that end state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, and there's another big, like, blinking red problem for the United States in here. So we've seen Israel when they had the Gaza Strip, which is encased in a little chain link fence, basically, and so everything was contained in there. And with all the IDF has at its disposal, 10 months later, they're still having to fight there. So the idea that they would then go up north into to the Hezbollah, where they have more troops, more defenses, et cetera, and have anything quick is just not even possible. So you're talking about, if they do, that's going to start a long lead time kind of an issue that also could be open-ended. But United States is already in a position to where our ammunition stocks are running critically low. And there was a report out just a couple of days ago that when somebody looking at the China-Taiwan issue, if we had to fight China, that we could run out of critical supplies within days in some of the interceptor missiles, and within a few weeks in many of the other key aspects of the ammunition. And that's just in that one area there. If we start still trying to support Ukraine with what we've been doing there, what we claim, while we now then have to spike in our efforts to help Israel down in this area and our own, especially if we get dragged into it, Doug, we don't have enough ammunition to last a long fight there. Forget about all these other areas that may fight. We just don't have the capacity.
But you have to weigh what you've just said, and I don't disagree with anything that you've noted, but you have to weigh that particular analysis against the analysis that is current in Washington and Jerusalem. And that analysis is there is no incentive to wait. This is the time to strike. If there were ever a point in Israel's history where it has the chance to establish its unchallenged supremacy in the region, it's now. All of its surrounding neighbors are very weak. We're talking about the Arab states. They're very weak. There's very little that they can do. They may have numbers, they may have large numbers of equipment, but they're not oriented to offensive warfare, and there's not much they can do to intervene to change things. If they could, they'd have already done it. So that means that within the region, your principal concern, other than Hezbollah, is Iran, and they dismiss out of hand the possibility that Turkey will ever do anything. I mean, that's the conventional wisdom in Israel. No, the Turks won't intervene. We can ignore that. It's sort of similar to the Germans in 1914, who absolutely did not believe that the British would intervene. You know, similar mentality. So from their vantage point, you're never going to have a better shot, because you really have now, if you're Mr. Netanyahu sitting in Jerusalem, you have absolute control of the United States Armed Forces and its capacities. But you're a realist. You know, that's not going to last forever. You don't know what the next election is going to bring. Yeah, sure, you essentially bought what I call the right wing of the Uniparty, which we call Republican. That's purchased, but is it reliable over the long haul? May or may not be. Then you have the left wing of the Uniparty under Kamala Harris. You've got serious reservations about it, because they call themselves the party of color. They're distinctly racist in their attitudes towards white people, and they don't like Israel. So, you know, you got to put yourself in the position of Mr. Netanyahu, and you say, if I have to pick a point in time to do this, this is it. So let's pull out all the stops. Let's go for broke, and we can win everything at one stroke. Okay. See how that works out.
Yeah, you know, it's ironic, because from a certain perspective, I observe the same thing, especially diplomatically. They'll never have another chance to actually launch this stuff and have muted if or no response, you know, to some of these actions, et cetera, and the support of the United States. But we keep getting back into that thing you talk about for most of your career about ends and means. And so, yeah, you may want to accomplish this, but if you don't have the capacity to do so, to go starting on that road without the ability to rationally bring it to a conclusion, I mean, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And to me, there is no prospect that Israel can actually militarily conquer this territory, even using the U.S. Armed Forces, before we run out of capacity, or there's so many more enemies join in and we can't match them all. This is a suicide mission to me, Doug.
Well, remember, the Tsar of Russia went through a similar calculation at the beginning of World War I. And the Russian general staff convinced the Tsar that his army was so enormous and he had so many troops, so many forces, that the Germans would simply be overwhelmed and run out of manpower and be incapable of fighting against Russia, that the Russians would overwhelm them. And he signed on for the calculation. If you look at the numbers and some of the underpinning assumptions, you could make a good argument for what he said. Of course, it ignored everything else. It ignored technology. It ignored the nature of the Germans and their training and their education and their leadership and so forth. There's something else that your viewers should consider doing, and that is on the internet. You can Google it, and you can actually listen to about 10 minutes of a transcript, a conversation that was captured in Finland in 1942 between Adolf Hitler and Field Marshal von Mannerheim, who was the commander-in-chief of Finnish forces and the leader of Finland at the time. And Adolf Hitler had flown in to see Mannerheim. I think the occasion was Mannerheim's birthday. I don't remember. But it's a wonderful 10 minutes. It's very revealing, because you hear him not as this persona we see in the newsreels, but as a normal human being speaking. And one of the things that Hitler says, he tells Mannerheim, you know, we were astonished when we overran the Ukraine and reached Kharkov and these other places. We found factories where they were producing 30, 40,000 tanks, where we saw hundreds of thousands of people who were effectively slaves working in these factories. He said, good Lord, who in their right mind builds 40 or 50,000 tanks in peacetime? For Hitler, this was incomprehensible. And then he said something that's very, very important to remember. He said, you know, if we had known this, we wouldn't have invaded Russia. We wouldn't have gone into the Soviet Union. Well,
Wow.
what is the logical conclusion if you realize the gravity of his statement? The logical conclusion is stop, pull back, cut a deal. This is bigger than you thought. You may win at the moment, but long term, the prospects are bad. Well, there was no thinking about that. Napoleon Bonaparte reached Smolensk and he held a council of war in 1812. And he said, I think we've gone far enough. I think we should turn back. This is ridiculous. He actually said that. You can read it. His adjutant wrote it up. And it was his generals and his marshals that said, oh, no, we're too close now. We need to march on. Bonaparte said, why? And they gave him all these reasons. And grudgingly, after 2 or 3 hours of discussion, he relented and said, all right, we'll march on to Moscow. He realized this was a dumb idea. So the real question is, why do people double down on dumb ideas even when they realize it's a dumb idea? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. There's a whole psychology behind it. I think that that's going to happen to Mr. Netanyahu and his friends. I think they're going to realize that. I think people in Washington are going to end up in a very similar position. We didn't sign up for this. We didn't expect this. Whoa, what are we going to do now? And everybody's going to say exactly what you heard when you were in Afghanistan, what I heard about Iraq. I remember having these conversations, and General Petraeus, I was visiting in November 2005 in Leavenworth. And he said, well, what do you think about Iraq? I said, I think we should leave. And he said, oh, we can't just leave. But, the point is we always do. You can't just leave. Oh, yes, you can. What did we do? We ultimately left. What are we going to do now in the face of what's happening at the conclusion of these hostilities with all of these penny packets of troops all over the region? Whatever's alive at the end, we're just going to leave. There's nothing there for us. There never was. So what are we doing here? When a friend of mine used to say, Doug, when you have no strategy, in other words, when there's no purpose, method, end state, when you haven't thought anything through, you end up in a place called Stalingrad. And you look around and say, okay, now what?
Yeah.
I think that's where we're headed collectively.
That's exactly what I fear. You just put more eloquently than I did, but that's the exact conclusion that I reach when I look at the ends and means and the stated objectives. They just don't line up. They don't match, and that inevitably leads to that point. We're probably beyond that point already in the Russia-Ukraine war, and we'll discover to our chagrin what's going to happen there. Probably something similar to what happened in Afghanistan, except on a bigger scale, which hopefully won't expand beyond that. But you start adding too many of these things in, and we don't have time to talk about it now. But if a lot of people are also pointing and posturing to go into the Indo-Pacific, and they just keep poking China over the Taiwan issue, and it's like, man, what are these people thinking? There was I will talk about it in just a second. You've probably seen it. There's a commission that was released by the United States Congress where they said, hey, we're vastly underutilized on our defense industrial base, and we need to fix that. And they said what we need to be able to do simultaneously is to defend the homeland, fight little wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, fight and defeat Russia if need be, fight and defeat China if need be, and fight and defeat Iran if need be. All of that simultaneously, and they want to have a defense to match with it. That's just lunacy and insanity in my view. But there are otherwise allegedly smart people and well-educated that are arguing for exactly that outcome.
Well, there have been a lot of smart people over the years in charge at the top of many nations that have made these kinds of mistakes. And they substitute wishful thinking for hard-nosed analysis. They replace realistic assumptions with assumptions based on what they hope will happen as opposed to what could happen. So, we're on a dangerous path. And all we can do is hope that someone at some point in time realizes exactly what we've been discussing. But, how long did it take us to ultimately get out of Vietnam? 10 years? Ridiculous. And for what? So we're quite capable of repeating the stupidity. And I think that's where we are now. And, I wish I wish that someone would think in these terms, but politicians, remember, politicians don't shape or change or alter public opinion. They tend to follow it. So right now, what is the public opinion? And they're going to follow it. They're followers. Some of them are sock puppets for lobbies of various kinds. That's clear, but most of them are just fellow travelers. They're in the herd. That's not helpful. And I don't see that anybody that's currently running for office, with the exception of I think RFK Jr. really understands it all. I think Donald Trump used to, but he's so captured now by the obsession with the presidency. I think he's lost sight of all these other issues.
In terms of public opinion and how the Congress follows it, I know you've got something in the works at Our Country, Our Choice, to where people can actually have an access to their elected leaders at every level, that maybe they can communicate that so that those people can know what they need to follow. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's we call it Republic, RE, and then public platform that will be launched in August, probably mid to late August. And it's designed to be a free speech platform. It doesn't matter who you are. The only restrictions inside the United States are as follows. If you hate the United States and you think it should be destroyed, you're going to be thrown off the platform. Okay, we're not going to tolerate that.
Good.
If you are a pornographer or you're selling that sort of thing, then you're not going to last on the platform. But if you want to go on there and set up your space and speak, you can do it. Nancy Pelosi can go on there just as readily as Candace Owens or anybody. It's open. And you have the opportunity to see, for visibility of everybody who represents you instantly, from county and town all the way up. We're trying to develop news feeds that will provide you, based upon where you live. You put in your zip code and out comes all the news that may be relevant to you, from local to national. And then there are opportunities for you to intervene. If you don't like something, you can write what it is that you don't like. You can express your opinion, and then you can send that opinion all over the United States, throughout your community, to your representatives, whatever it is. You'll be able to hit a button and boom, you're going to reach people. This is the kind of thing that we've been working on for the last 2 years. A lot of time and money and resources have been invested in it. And I think Americans will love it once they get on it. You can go on there for free and read everything, but you can't take the actions that I just described unless you pay to get on the platform. So we'll have more to say about it in the future. It's called Republic. It's not part of OCOC. It's a separate company called Truth and Media. They're the ones doing this, but we at OCOC are going to go on there because we see this as an enormously powerful tool that we can utilize. And we're telling all the organizations of a similar mindset to do the same, because we're sick of being canceled, Dan.
Yeah.
That's it. You've experienced this, I'm sure. I certainly have. The algorithms are changed to suppress you. Google doesn't like what you say. YouTube doesn't like what you say. You end up being pushed down the pecking order. So that's not going to happen here. You can post videos, you can write things, you can develop things, briefings, whatever. You can hold meetings online. You can do all of that over this platform. Wow, and you can assemble people to meet with you. You can go to them. The nice thing is that if you're in Massachusetts and you see something happening in your schools that involves the sexualization of children and you don't like it, well, you could contact everybody in Oregon or Washington State or Michigan or elsewhere that feels the same way. And suddenly you can self-organize. Nobody's going to lead you to do this. You can get on there and you can organize others who share your views. I think this is brilliant. I think this is the real essence of this word that we hear all the time called democracy. Only the people that utter it repeatedly don't mean it.
Right.
They're talking about a different form of government from what we're discussing. They're not interested in free speech. And free speech is the foundation, as we know. So, no, I think this could be very good. And there'll be more. We'll say more about it in the future. And we'll get the word out to as many people as possible. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to mention it.
Well, you bet. And we're eager to help you share that in any way that we can. And we'll look forward once you're ready to they're ready to publicly roll it out. If you can come back on and tell us some more.
Sure.
And we'll direct everybody to, who's watching our show to go and check it out so that they can add their voice to it and have their
Absolutely.
voice heard in a way and not canceled. I love that phrasing there.
Yeah.
But thanks for coming on today, Doug. It is, even though this is a tough conference topic here, always appreciate your unvarnished view and telling things like it is. And we really appreciate that.
Right. Thank you.
And thank you guys for coming on board too. Again, we always ask you to like this video and subscribe to it. I know a lot of our viewers haven't done either of those things, and it really does help us get the word out there. So we ask you to do that, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.